Every spring in the Niagara region in Ontario, you can look out onto the once quiet and dormant vineyards and see workers spotted throughout the fields. And they're pruning the grapevines. They're pruning the plants. They're getting the plants ready to produce the best fruit possible. Pruning the grapevine is essential to producing good fruit. Left to its own device, a grapevine will just grow and spread out rampantly, if you will, just haphazardly. And in the end, it won't produce very good fruit at all. It may produce some, but not a lot. And those that it does produce, in those little bunches of grapes, some will be smaller and more bitter. Some will be larger and have no flavor at all. It just would not produce good quality fruit without being pruned. Growing grapes is a very complex art form, if you will, but nothing can substitute a good pruning of the plant. In John's Gospel today, Jesus compares his disciples to the branches of a grapevine. He tells them that as the branches, they are to produce good fruit, and the production of good fruit does call for the occasional pruning of the branches. This is chapter 15 of John, verse number 1 and 2. Jesus speaking. This is right after the Last Supper. It's part of the upper room discourse, they call it. So they've had the Last Supper. Jesus has washed the disciples' feet. He says to the disciples, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." So he's saying to the disciples something very deep, something very profound, and he's giving them an assurance, actually, because he knows that he's going to die. He knows that he's not going to be with the disciples physically any longer. So he's preparing them for how they can manage life without him. So Jesus, first of all, he's not admonishing them. He's not punishing them. He's not telling them to do something in this particular sense. He's not telling them that they have to do anything to be branched into the vine. He says in the very next verse that they're already clean. He says, you're already part of the vine. He says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Not you will be the branches if you do this and this and this and this. He says, I am the vine and you are the branches. And Jesus says that the disciples, by their faith, are already being made clean. They're already secure. They've already been made pure by the simple fact that they're his disciples. Jesus has already made them clean. He's already made them guiltless because of their faith in Jesus. They are automatically branches of that vine that is in him. So Jesus says, I'm the vine that nurtures those branches. You are the branches. So in the same way that a real vine planted in the ground will take nutrients from the ground and bring it up through the vine and then out to the branches and then produce good fruit through that good nutrition from the ground, Jesus says, so you too, as branches attached to me, the vine, you too will be nourished by the vine. You too will be fed by the vine. And so Jesus, as the vine, nurtures the disciples. That's what he's saying, that by their faith, they're directly identifiable and nurtured by Jesus Christ. The second thing he says, he wants to get across in this analogy, this metaphor of the vine, is that in order to remain a healthy branch that produces good fruit, then the disciples have to remain attached to the vine. They have to remain feeding off the vine. And this is the best description, I think, of Christians' relationship with Jesus, in my view. That the disciples are to abide. That's the word that he says, that they are to abide in the vine. The disciples are to abide in Jesus. And it's more than a nice poetic term of, you're about to hang out, that they hang out together. It's something deeper than that. It actually implies a continuous abiding. And it means literally to continuously stay, to continually remain with. That is, to never leave. Never leave Jesus. Abide in Jesus. As branches, in the same way that the branches are attached and abide and rely and depend on the vine, he's saying to the disciples, you too abide in me. You abide in Jesus. Obviously, because when a branch is removed from the vine, does not abide with the vine, it naturally dies, and it's considered worthless. Jesus says that they're burned in the fire. So where the disciples are to abide are with Jesus. And now think about where they abided, where they lived, where they remained, where they sought their life source before they met Jesus. They were in fishing boats. They were in tax booths. They were dependent on economics and labor for their own spiritual development, if you will. The things that can drain you actually of spiritual growth. That's where they abided in their lives before Jesus. They abided in the world, things that put a strain on them. But Jesus says, abide in me, abide in my love. Abide in my teaching, abide in my word, and you will become spiritually rich. And that's what Jesus means by this whole metaphor. Is to remain in Jesus is to have an abundant spiritual life. And he tells us how to do that by abiding in his word, by abiding in his love. So the fruit of the Christian spirit then, like the grapevine in Niagara, is never produced by allowing the believer to be left on his own. It's never produced by allowing Christians to be permitted to grow on their own or left to their own devices, to those things which we naturally reach out to, which we naturally tend toward, those things such as greed and envy and lust and pride and money and economics and wealth and status. They're not going to produce good fruit. They're actually going to poison the plant. So rather, Jesus is directing the disciples now toward a spiritual development, a spiritual growth, and a spiritual security. This is important because Jesus is not telling his disciples here that bearing good fruit means being a good evangelist. He's not telling the disciples that a parish will be cut off the vine if they're not increasing in numbers or putting bums in the pew, as the saying goes, and rapidly growing in numerical growth. He is saying quite simply that if you want to bear the qualities of good faith in him, spiritually growing, becoming spiritually mature, then you need to abide in him in the same way a branch abides and relies and depends upon the vine to which it is attached. So, what is this good fruit then? What is he talking about? What are the good qualities in him? Well, in verse 8 we can find that. Jesus says in verse 8, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to me my disciples." Where have you heard that phrase, "prove to me my disciples," before? In John 13:35, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples." And what is it? By what? That you love one another. And he touches on that in verse 12 here. He says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." So throughout this whole upper discourse is this emphasis on Jesus as the source of spiritual nourishment and Jesus as the source of perfect love. And he's saying that, he says in verse 9, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love." A fruitful branch is one that loves God with heart, soul, and mind. One who loves the neighbor as himself. One who loves one another in the church. This is the fruit that he's calling for. He's not calling for evangelism here. He does that somewhere else. But the fruit of the vine, the fruit of the branches that stems, that flows from Jesus and the Father, that plants Jesus, that tends to Jesus, that tends to the soil, that the fruit, that the nourishment that grows out of Jesus and into the branches, the disciples, produces the fruit of love, unconditional love. One commentator expands on it a little bit. He says this, he says, here's what some of the good fruit is that you will never exclude one another because of your failures. That you would never let one another go away in need, that you would never push one another under a bus, that you are always willing to walk alongside one another, and that you would give your life for one another. Now, you may recall in the very beginning in these verses that I read, Jesus says, every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes it, so that it may bear more fruit. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to experience difficulties in life, and that these difficulties in life are a way of God, of Jesus, pruning us of those other tendencies toward greed, envy, and all those other tendencies that I mentioned before. It is to bring us back from the urges and desires of our world, which we do get into once in a while. We do get comfortable sometimes, and we do slip back into these urges of this world. But our suffering and our challenges and our difficulties are a way of pruning those qualities away, back out from us. Our branches are being pruned. We're being pruned away from that and back toward the presence and abiding and remaining in Jesus. So we're not left to grow wild like those grapevines might be. We're left to grow wild and produce poor fruit, but we're not left to grow wild. And in our difficulties, God is pruning us of all of those things that take us away from Him, all of those things that are spiritually bad for us. We're being pruned from our destructive behavior, pruned from greed and envy and lust and pride. That we're pruned of the tendencies that we sometimes find so comforting, but are not really very good for us. So it's really to remind us in these difficult times that our life source is the vine. Our life source is Jesus Christ. Spiritually, physically, He just provides for us. It is to keep us from abiding in the fruitless world with its perishable rewards, from the fishes, from the boats, from the taxation booths, and to draw us back into abiding with Him. And Jesus is saying quite simply, I am your life source. I am your life source, says Jesus, and feed from me. I'm going to leave you with this short quote from Andrew Murray, and he's in one of his commentaries, and he's talking about this particular passage. He says, "You, Christian, you, me, are the branches of the Lord Jesus Christ. If there is in your heart the consciousness that you are not a strong, healthy, fruit-bearing branch, not closely linked with Jesus, not living in Him as you should be, then listen to Jesus say, I am the vine. I will receive you. I will draw you to myself. I will bless you. I will strengthen you, and I will fill you with my Spirit." Amen.